Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. This time, we're going deep into the world of Chris Butler,
Um,
also known as Siddhiswarupananda.
right.
You guys have been busy sending us a ton of stuff.
Yeah.
Online forum discussions, social media posts, articles,
Mhm.
even some personal accounts, which is really fascinating.
It is. It
Thanks,
is.
Steph.
It gives us a real opportunity to kind of get a
Yeah.
broad picture, not just of the teachings, but also the experiences of his followers and
Yeah.
the
Yeah,
controversies.
controversies, yeah, that's exactly what we're here to do.
Yeah.
Help you guys separate fact from speculation and kind of understand,
Yeah.
this complex figure.
Yeah. It's a lot to unpack.
It is. So where do we even begin?
Well, I guess chronologically makes sense to start with his background. He
Yeah.
was a student of A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, the founder of ISKCON back
Yeah.
in the 60s,
Okay.
but then left ISKCON in the early 70s and went on to found the Science of Identity Foundation.
Right, Siffy.
Or SIF, yeah.
And that's where things get
That's when it gets
interesting.
interesting. Yeah.
So his teachings are rooted in Gaudiya Vaishnavism,
Right.
but he also brings in elements of yoga and tantra,
Mm-hmm.
and some even label him as Sahajiya, which I have to admit
Yeah.
sounds a bit ominous.
Yeah, it can be, depending on who you ask.
Right.
In Gaudiya Vaishnavism, Sahajiya is often used to criticize those who are seen as deviating
Okay.
from the traditional practices or maybe taking shortcuts on the spiritual path.
So why is he considered a Sahajiya by
Yeah.
some?
Right.
What specifically about his teachings is seen as controversial?
Well, there's a few key points, I guess.
Okay.
First, Butler emphasizes self-criticism and surrender to Krishna
Okay.
as the way to experience divine love, which,
Right.
sounds pretty standard for Gaudiya Vaishnavism, right?
Right.
But critics argue that he takes it a step further,
Okay.
encouraging his followers to view themselves as inherently unworthy and completely reliant on him for spiritual guidance.
So it's not just about humility, it's about creating a dependency.
Yeah, that's the argument. And it ties into another point of contention, which is his departure from traditional sannyasa.
Okay.
For those unfamiliar, sannyasa is a stage in Hinduism where individuals renounce worldly life,
Mm-hmm.
take vows of celibacy, poverty,
Right.
and dedicate themselves fully to spiritual pursuits.
Right. I remember reading about that.
Yeah,
But he ended up marrying, which would be a pretty big deal.
exactly. And it wasn't just any marriage that raised eyebrows.
Yeah.
He married Wailana, who was previously married to one of his disciples.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, that definitely adds another layer to the whole thing.
Yeah.
It's not just a deviation from tradition. It also involves a power dynamic
Absolutely.
between guru and disciple.
Absolutely. And that power dynamic is a recurring theme
Okay.
in many of the accusations against him.
Like,
For instance, several sources allege that he would impose fines on his followers
okay.
for minor infractions.
Really?
Yeah.
Give me an example.
Things like, let's say, serving his dinner late.
Seriously.
That's what former members are saying, yeah.
He would fine people for that.
That's what they claim.
Wow.
And, the arbitrary nature of these fines,
Right.
coupled with his position as a spiritual leader, is what leads some to describe Sif as having cult-like characteristics.
Okay, so we're starting to see a pattern here.
Yeah.
But let's get specific about these cult-like allegations,
Yeah.
because some of the things are pretty shocking.
Yeah.
There's talk of foot worship, consumption of toenail clippings.
I know.
It almost sounds too bizarre to be true.
I know. It's definitely unsettling stuff.
Yeah.
But it's important to remember that these are allegations
Right.
from former members, and we need to approach them with a critical eye.
Of course.
At the same time,
Yeah.
these accounts can't be simply dismissed,
Right.
especially when they come from multiple sources.
So how do we make sense of this? I mean, are these isolated incidents, or is there a bigger picture we're missing?
Well, if we look at the structure of SIF,
Okay.
as described in the sources,
Yeah.
it does raise some red flags.
Okay.
There's a strong emphasis on loyalty to Butler and their organization.
Okay.
And critics argue that this creates a hierarchy where dissent is discouraged.
Okay.
And questioning leadership can have serious consequences,
Well,
like getting excommunicated.
Look, wow.
There's a case mentioned in the sources where a disciple in the Philippines was excommunicated simply for wanting to receive spiritual initiation
Okay.
from another guru.
Oh, okay.
So in traditional Gaudiya Vaishnavism,
Yeah.
seeking guidance from multiple teachers isn't necessarily frowned upon,
Right.
but in a more, I guess you could say,
Yeah.
closed system like SIF,
Right.
that kind of independent exploration can be seen as a threat.
So it's less about spiritual growth and more about...
Yeah, that's the control. That's the argument some make.
Yeah.
And it's further fueled by allegations of financial exploitation. Former members claim they were pressured to donate money, surrender ownership of their businesses,
Right.
or even work for free for Butler and SIF.
And speaking of money, we can't ignore the financial aspect of SIF's businesses, like the down-to-earth health food stores.
Yeah.
Critics argue that these ventures are used to funnel money back to him
Right.
and his organization.
Yeah, and there's this rather shocking quote attributed to Butler where he allegedly said,
Okay.
"Are those assholes still running that store in Lahaina?
Wow.
Why don't they give it to DTE, assholes? And they call themselves my disciples, making all kinds of money while their kids skate and surf, assholes.
Oh, my.
They should give it to me."
Wow. Okay, that definitely doesn't sound like something a renunciate spiritual leader would say.
No, it doesn't.
Especially one who's,
Right.
taken vows of poverty and things like that.
If that quote is authentic, it certainly contradicts
Yeah.
the image of a selfless guru,
Yeah.
focused on the spiritual well-being of his followers.
It really does, and it makes you wonder about the motivations behind his teachings and the structure of SIF itself.
Exactly. And it raises even more questions when you consider the allegations of a cover-up, of serious incidents like sexual assault within SIF to protect the organization's image.
That's a very serious accusation.
It is.
We should probably delve into that a bit more.
Absolutely. But before we do, I think it's also important to explore the positive experiences some individuals have had with Butler's teachings.
Of course, it's not all doom and gloom.
Right.
There are people who genuinely found meaning and purpose through SIF.
Yeah.
It would be unfair to dismiss their experiences.
Exactly. And by examining both the positive and the negative accounts, we can start to get, I think, a more nuanced understanding.
So you're saying we need to consider the full spectrum
I think so.
of experience, even those that might seem contradictory.
Yeah, because I think that's often where the most insightful discoveries are made. And it might help us answer the question of how someone like Chris Butler can inspire both deep devotion and serious accusations.
That's a good point. It seems like we've just scratched the surface
I think so.
of this deep dive.
Yeah.
There's so much more to unpack.
There is, and I think the next logical step is to delve deeper into those allegations of SIF covering up serious incidents.
Let's do it.
All right.
We'll be right back after a short break.
These allegations of a cover-up are particularly disturbing. Because they strike at the heart of what a spiritual community should be. A safe haven for its members.
A safe haven, right. And the sources are kind of painting a picture of SIF as almost the opposite of that.
Yeah, there's this pervasive sense of fear and control that permeates the organization.
Yeah, and in that type of environment, it can be really difficult for victims of abuse to come forward.
Absolutely, especially when the abuser is a powerful figure.
Right, like the guru.
Like the guru, exactly.
Yeah.
And the sources suggest that speaking out against Butler or any high-ranking members of SIF was met with, swift and severe consequences, including expulsion and shunning.
So essentially, victims were silenced.
Yeah.
Out of fear of retaliation.
That's the implication. And what makes it even more troubling is that these allegations of sexual misconduct don't appear to be isolated incidents.
Right.
The sources suggest a pattern of behavior that spans decades.
That's just heartbreaking. And to think that this was happening under the guise of spiritual seeking.
Right.
It's really unsettling.
It is. It really highlights the need for transparency and accountability.
Within any organization.
Within any organization, absolutely.
Especially those dealing with vulnerable individuals.
Yeah, I completely agree.
But transparency seems to be something that, at least according to these sources, SAF actively worked against.
Yes, there's very little information publicly available about their internal practices or finances.
Right, and it seems like, according to the sources, this intentional secrecy was used to protect Butler and his inner circle from scrutiny.
And to maintain control over the narrative surrounding SIF.
Right, by controlling the flow of information,
they
could essentially create their own reality.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about the alleged cover-up and the culture of fear within SIF.
Yeah.
But let's kind of delve into some of the specific practices that raise concerns.
Yeah.
Because this is where things get really bizarre.
Right. We have these accounts of foot worship.
Right.
The consumption of Butler's toenail clippings.
Yeah.
Even the use of his foot bath water in food preparation.
I don't even know where to begin.
It's hard to know where to even begin with stuff like that.
It's almost surreal.
Yeah.
It's like something out of a dark comedy or a dystopian novel.
Yeah.
But to those involved,
Right.
it was likely presented as a legitimate spiritual practice.
And that's what makes cults so dangerous.
Right.
They can warp people's perceptions of reality
Yeah.
and convince them that bizarre or even harmful practices are actually acts of devotion.
So how does this happen? How do people get drawn to these kinds of situations?
It's a complex process, I think, that often involves preying on people's vulnerabilities. You know, they might be seeking meaning or purpose in their lives, or maybe they're going through a difficult time looking for answers or a sense of belonging.
And a charismatic figure like Butler could easily step in.
Absolutely.
And provide that.
Exactly. And once that trust is established, it's easier for the leader to start, making demands and exerting control. The sources mention that Butler would often isolate his followers from their families and friends.
Oh, wow.
Creating a dependence on him and Sif.
That's a classic tactic of cults, isn't it?
It is.
Isolate individuals from their support systems.
Right.
And make them reliant on the group for everything.
Exactly. And without that external perspective, it's easier for the group's ideology to take hold.
Right.
The sources also suggest that Butler discouraged critical thinking and questioning of his authority.
So anyone who dared to challenge him or his teachings was essentially ostracized.
That seems to have been the case.
Yeah.
And this reinforces the idea that Sif operated more like a closed system where conformity was valued above all else.
You know, it's interesting because on the surface, Butler's teachings seem to align with traditional Gaudiya Vaishnavism.
Right.
But the way they were implemented within Sif appears to have been quite different.
That's a very astute observation.
Yeah.
And it gets to the heart of what makes Butler such a controversial figure.
Yeah.
He presented himself as a guru in the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition, but critics argue that he distorted those teachings to serve his own agenda.
So it's not just about the teachings themselves.
Right.
It's about how they were used to manipulate and control people.
Exactly. And that's where the label of Sahajya comes into play. Critics argue that he was more interested in the outward trappings of spiritual authority than in the genuine spiritual well-being of his followers.
So we've talked about the cult-like aspects of Sif and Butler's alleged manipulations.
Right.
But let's shift gears a bit and talk about the positive experiences that some individuals have had with his teachings.
Right.
Because as we mentioned earlier, it's important to acknowledge those accounts as well.
It is.
So what do the sources say about the positive impact of Sif?
Well, there are several testimonials from current and former members who credit Butler's teachings with helping them overcome addiction, find purpose in their lives, and develop a deeper connection to Krishna.
So for some, Sif provided a sense of community and support that they may have been lacking elsewhere.
Yes, and the sources suggest that many individuals were drawn to the simplicity and clarity of Butler's message. He emphasized the practice of bhakti yoga, which is the path of devotion to Krishna, as a way to attain spiritual liberation.
And that message resonated with people from various backgrounds.
It seems so.
Regardless of their prior religious beliefs or experiences.
That seems to be the case, and it's important to remember that individual experiences within any group can be incredibly diverse.
Of course.
While some may feel harmed or manipulated, others may genuinely find meaning and fulfillment.
Right, and it's not our place to judge those individual experiences.
No, not at all.
What we can do is try to understand the broader context and the power dynamic at play that may have contributed to both the positive and the negative outcomes.
Absolutely. And it's also worth noting that the sources highlight the positive impact that Sif has had on promoting vegetarianism and environmental awareness through their down-to-earth stores.
Right.
That's something that a lot of people appreciate, regardless of their religious beliefs or affiliation with SIFE.
That's a good point.
Yeah, it shows that even within a controversial organization, there can be positive aspects that benefit the wider community.
Okay, so we've explored both the positive and negative aspects of SIFE, but we can't ignore the elephant in the room, the allegations of financial impropriety.
Yeah.
The sources claim that Butler amassed significant personal wealth while demanding strict adherence to his teachings. From his followers, some sources even describe a system of fines for minor infractions.
Yes, and this is where the line between spiritual leadership and personal gain becomes blurred.
Very blurred.
The sources allege that Butler pressured his followers to give him money, patents, trademarks, even ownership of their businesses.
And those claims are backed up by personal accounts. From former members who say they felt manipulated or coerced into giving up their assets. It seems like there's a recurring theme here. Power and control.
Power and control,
Whether it's through demanding absolute loyalty, imposing arbitrary fines, or allegedly exploiting followers financially, it all points to an unhealthy dynamic.
It's hard to reconcile these allegations with the image of a selfless spiritual leader who renounces material possessions. And it raises the question of whether Butler was truly motivated by a desire to spread spiritual teachings, or whether he was more interested in personal gain and power.
Well, there's also that shocking quote where he refers to his followers as assholes for not handing over their business to him.
That quote, if authentic, is very telling.
It certainly doesn't sound like something a compassionate or enlightened being would say.
It doesn't, no.
And it further fuels the suspicion that his teachings might have been twisted to serve his own materialistic desires.
His own personal gain.
Okay, so we've discussed the allegations of financial exploitation. But we also need to address the issue of Patrick Butler, who is allegedly funding some of Butler's activities with money earned through drug smuggling.
It's a connection that's hard to ignore.
Yeah.
The sources suggest that Butler, despite his criminal activities, remained a prominent figure within SIF.
Even after his convictions.
Even after his convictions. And Butler publicly defended Butler, stating that he was simply trying to help him get back on track.
That defense is hard to swallow.
It is, considering the nature of Butler's crimes.
It really is.
Yeah.
And it raises questions about Butler's judgment and his willingness to overlook criminal behavior.
Especially from someone who is allegedly providing financial support to SIF.
Yeah, it creates a web of contradictions.
It does.
That's difficult to disentangle.
It is.
On one hand, Butler presents himself as a spiritual guide, advocating for ethical living. Yet he's seemingly willing to accept money from someone involved in illegal activities.
It's a jarring inconsistency.
It is.
That casts a shadow of doubt over his entire enterprise.
And it further reinforces the accusations of hypocrisy that have been leveled against him. Now, before we move on, I think it's important to touch on another controversial aspect of Butler's leadership. His involvement in politics. The sources discuss the founding of the Independence for Godly Government Party by his followers. And the suspicion that one of them, Rick Reed, might have leaked confidential information from the Hawaii prosecutor's office to Butler.
That's a fascinating element.
It is.
Of this story. The creation of a political party by his followers suggests a desire to influence the political landscape, which is a significant departure from the traditional role
of a spiritual leader.
Right? And the allegation that Rick Reed might have leaked confidential information adds another layer of intrigue.
It does.
It raises concerns about the potential for abuse of power and the blurring of lines between religious authority and political influence.
It certainly does.
It's crucial to remember that these are just allegations, but the patterns that emerge from the sources paint a concerning picture of Butler's methods and motivations.
It seems like we keep coming back to this idea of power and control.
Power and control,
Whether it's through spiritual teachings, financial dealings, or political maneuvering. The allegations suggest a desire to exert influence and maintain dominance.
And that's what makes this deep dive so compelling.
Yeah.
It forces us to confront the darker side of spirituality and to question the motives of those who claim to have all the answers.
Well said.
Yeah.
It seems like we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
We've explored the allegations of cover-ups, the cult-like aspects of SIF, the positive and negative experiences of Butler's followers, and the controversies surrounding his financial dealings and political involvement. But there's still one piece of the puzzle. We haven't fully addressed Butler's teachings themselves.
That's right. And I think it's important to dive into the specifics of his teachings, particularly the concept of Sahadiyya, and why it sparked so much debate within the Gaudiya Vaishnava community.
Okay, so let's unpack that.
Okay.
What exactly is Sahajiyya?
Okay.
And why is Butler seen as a proponent of this controversial path?
Well, as we discussed earlier, Sahajiyya is a term often used to criticize those who deviate from traditional Gaudiya Vaishnava practices or take shortcuts on the spiritual path. It's generally associated with a focus on immediate gratification or sensual pleasure rather than the rigorous disciplines traditionally emphasized in bhakti yoga.
And how do Butler's teachings fit into this?
Well, critics argue that his emphasis on self-criticism and complete surrender to him as the guru creates a dynamic where followers become overly dependent on him for spiritual validation.
So instead of empowering his followers to develop their own relationship with Krishna, he's essentially inserting himself as the intermediary.
That's the argument. And it's further complicated by his incorporation of elements from Tantra and yoga.
We touched on that earlier.
While those traditions are not inherently incompatible with Gaudiya Vaishnavism. The way Butler integrates them, according to the sources, raises concerns about whether he's distorting the original teachings for his own purposes.
The sources specifically mention his alleged emphasis on sexual creation and kundalini concepts more associated with Tantra than traditional Gaudiya Vaishnavism.
Exactly. And this is where the accusations of Sahajiyya become more pointed. Critics argue that he's cherry-picking elements from different traditions to create a system that ultimately serves his own desires rather than genuine spiritual liberation.
Well, it's not just about the teachings themselves, it's about the underlying intentions.
The underlying intentions, exactly.
Yeah.
And the potential for those teachings to be misused.
It seems like this deep dive into the world of Chris Butler is less about finding definitive answers and more about raising critical questions.
That's true. And ultimately, it's up to each individual to decide what they make of the information we've presented.
Okay, so we've explored a lot of ground here.
We have.
But there's still some loose ends to tie up. We need to talk about the lasting impact of Butler's teachings and the complex legacy he leaves behind.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to examine the role of the media in shaping public perceptions of SIF. And the challenges faced by those who have left the organization.
Because leaving a group like SIF is often a very difficult and painful process.
It is.
Especially for those who've invested years of their lives. And may have experienced significant harm.
Exactly. And that's where the need for support and understanding becomes crucial.
Well said. It seems like there's still much to uncover in this deep dive.
I think so.
Into the world of Chris Butler.
Yeah.
Are you ready to explore these final layers of the story?
I am. It's a story that I think needs to be told.
It feels like with every piece we uncover, the picture of Chris Butler and SIF just keeps getting more and more complex.
It's definitely been a journey.
It has.
You know, we've seen how his teachings, while rooted in Gaudiya Vaishnavism, have taken, well, a unique and controversial turn, let's say.
And we've explored the allegations of manipulation, exploitation, cover-ups, which have really cast a shadow over his legacy.
They have.
And I think as we kind of delve into this final part of our deep dive, it's crucial to acknowledge the lasting impact of Butler's actions on his followers. The sources paint such a heartbreaking picture of families torn apart, individuals ostracized, and this general climate of fear and manipulation.
Permeating the organization. The human cost of these controversies cannot be ignored.
It can't.
Many former members describe leaving SIFA as, well, as a traumatic experience.
Right.
Often involving loss of community, identity, even their sense of self.
It's like having the rug pulled out from under you.
It is.
Imagine dedicating years of your life to a spiritual path.
Right.
Only to discover that it was built on deceit and control.
Right. How do you even...
It's going to be incredibly disorienting.
Incredibly disorienting. And it takes years, even decades, for people to process the trauma and rebuild their lives.
And to make matters worse,
right,
there's often a stigma associated with leaving a group that's been labeled a cult.
Yeah.
People might not understand
they don't get it.
What they went through.
Right.
Or even believe their accounts of abuse.
Yeah. And that isolation just makes the whole healing process even more challenging.
Much harder.
It is.
Yeah, it's crucial that we approach these individuals with compassion and understanding.
Absolutely.
Recognizing the courage it takes to break free from a controlling environment like that.
It takes a lot of strength.
It really does.
It does.
And I think it's also important to acknowledge the role of the media.
Yeah, the media plays a big role.
In shaping public perceptions of Seth.
Yeah.
The sources mentioned that Butler and his organization have been the subject of investigations and exposés over the years.
Yeah.
But they've managed to maintain a relatively low profile.
Yeah, and that's partly due to their control over information.
Right.
Seth has been very adept at deflecting criticism.
Okay.
Dismissing negative media coverage as persecution.
Right.
Or attacks by those who just don't understand their teachings.
So they've created their own narrative.
Exactly.
Controlling the message.
Right.
And minimizing any negative publicity.
Exactly. And that makes it even more difficult for former members to have their voices heard.
Their stories heard.
Right. Their accounts are often dismissed as biased or unreliable.
While Butler and his inner circle maintain that veneer of respectability.
Exactly.
It's a classic case of he said, she said.
It is.
Where those with power and influence are often believed over those who have been marginalized or silenced.
It's a real problem, and that's why it's so important to have these conversations, to shine a light on these allegations.
To give a voice to the voiceless.
Yes, exactly. And to provide a platform for those who have been harmed to share their experiences.
You're right. Silence only protects the abusers.
It does.
By talking about these issues, we can raise awareness, challenge the status quo.
Hopefully prevent others from falling victim to similar situations.
It's also important to remember that the allegations against Butler and Sif aren't unique to them.
They're not.
There are countless other spiritual groups and leaders who have been accused of similar abuses.
It's a widespread problem.
Yeah. So this deep dive isn't just about Chris Butler. It's about this broader phenomenon of spiritual abuse and the need for critical thinking.
Absolutely.
And discernment when exploring any spiritual path.
You gotta be careful out there.
You really do.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing the red flags, asking tough questions, and trusting your instincts when something doesn't feel right.
That's so important.
It is.
Your intuition is a powerful tool.
It is.
It can be your best guide when navigating these complex situations.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of Chris Butler, what are the key takeaways?
Well, I think the most important takeaway is that no spiritual path or teacher is immune to the potential for abuse.
That's a really good point.
Even those who seem genuine and well-intentioned can have hidden agendas or succumb to the temptations of power.
So it's crucial to approach any spiritual path with a healthy dose of skepticism. And to never surrender your critical thinking abilities.
Absolutely. Ask questions, do your research, talk to others who have experience with the group or the teacher. You're considering.
Don't just take things at face value and trust your instincts. If something feels off or uncomfortable.
Don't ignore those red flags.
Don't ignore those red flags.
They're there for a reason.
They are.
Yeah.
Well, this deep dive has been a journey.
It has.
And I think we've all learned a lot.
I think so.
We've explored the complexities of his teachings. The controversies that have surrounded him. And the impact of his actions on the lives of so many.
It's a story that raises some important questions.
It does.
About faith, power, and, I guess, the human search for meaning.
And for you listening, we leave you with this final thought.
Okay.
How does this story challenge your understanding of spiritual leadership and the pursuit of truth? What lessons can you take away from this deep dive to inform your own path? Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
And we'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.